Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Kyrgyz noon lecture. My name is Benjamin Paloff. I'm the director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies here at the University of Michigan. And it is my pleasure to welcome the members of our live audience, as well as those who are Zooming in virtually. Those of you who are here in person, as well as those who are attending online, will have the opportunity to pose questions or offer brief comments after today's talk. If you are attending online, please share your comments or your questions over the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we will look through those questions, monitor them, and then share them here with our guest and our live audience. Before we proceed, I want to thank the Department of Anthropology for co-sponsoring this event, and also call your attention to some upcoming events that we have on our calendar. It's a very, very busy week here, so on these two screens or online, you can see the events that we have coming up just in the next couple of days. Tomorrow, Thursday, that's October 14th, from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. throughout the day, there will be a conference on gender and health in global, transnational, and historical perspectives. This will be a virtual conference, and you can attend or monitor its proceedings during the day online. I believe we're adding a link to that in the chat on Zoom right now. And there will be various speakers, including some presentations pertinent to Russian, Central, and Eastern Europe. On the 15th to the 18th, that is throughout the weekend, starting on Friday, we are hosting the 2021 Liszt Society Festival, themed around Liszt and Hungary. And this is a music performance festival, so it is entirely live, and the link to that event will also be available to you online. This is sponsored by the School of Music, Theater, and Dance, the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and it is, in fact, going to be at multiple locations around campus. And then finally, also across the weekend from Friday through Sunday, is a long-awaited conference on the Russian postmodern author Viktor Pelevin. The conference is called Viktor Pelevin, Post-Soviet, Postmodern, Global. And there will be multiple speakers, both online and in person. This event is co-sponsored, again, by the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies and the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures. That will be held in the East Conference Room of the Rackham Graduate School building just down the Ingalls Mall. I think that's everything we have in the next couple days. Stay tuned for next week. So it is my great pleasure to welcome Noor O'Neill Bordabieva, professor of anthropology at Purdue University, Fort Wayne, who is coming to us to reflect on a number of intersecting topics, some general, quite theoretical, that is the definition of culture, how we understand culture, as well as some quite practical, including development work. I think of Professor Bordabieva's description of her own talk as being very much when the rubber hits the road and the road hits road building. A theory based on cultural research in Central Asia, as well as a practical application of that theory based on development work. She spent 4 years working in Kyrgyzstan as a development professional and an ethnographer before launching a very exciting academic career. Her research focuses on gender, religious change, and the development sector in the former Soviet Union. And she's published numerous articles in scholarly journals on these topics, including in flagship journals of our various research fields: Slavic Review, Central Asian Survey, Anthropological Quarterly. Her book, Visions of Development in Central Asia, Revitalizing the Culture Concept, was published by Lexington Books in 2019, and because of global developments I do not need to familiarize yourself with, we were not able to invite her to speak on that book immediately after its release, but we are excited to have her with us today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bordobiyeva.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I was told that if I stand 12 feet away from you, I can take my mask off. So thank you so much, Benjamin Paloff, for this wonderful introduction and for the invitation. Thanks to Liz Malinkin for helping get me here and for organizing a lot of this. And also thank you to the Center for Russian, Eastern European, and Eurasian Studies here at the University of Michigan. I'm really happy to be here today. So I am going to very, very quickly turn my clock on. I know that I should also thank all the people who made this journey in person to be with us here in the room. It's really exciting to see people in person. And thank you also to all the people who are joining us in the web universe. So my talk today is called Does Culture Matter? And this is actually the title that I wanted for my book, but the publisher told me I couldn't put questions in the title. So I am bringing it back now, now that I'm in control again. So I'm really interested in exploring ways to theorize culture that can help us maybe do development better, and also to understand how development workers understand culture, because as an anthropologist, I'm interested in how my informants think about what they do. So the first thing I'd like to talk about then is culture. So that's the theoretical project that I'm working on. And I'm going to say something a little bit blasphemous for those of you who have an anthropological background. I'm going to actually begin by proposing that culture is an instinct. So that's not, the kind of thing that you hear in an introduction to anthropology class. But stay with me here for a moment. This is the kind of claim that one often does hear that has problematic implications. We hear it in sociobiology, we hear it in evolutionary psychology, and it is often used actually to develop understandings of human behavior and diversity that narrow the possibilities of human thriving, that narrow our understanding of what it means to be human. And that is not the way that I'm going to use it today. I'm going to talk about culture as an instinct insofar as it is a mechanism that produces diversity, diverse lifeways. It's a mechanism that helps us respond to complex, dynamic environments. As cultural beings, we have an instinct to reproduce things that we've seen, but we also must respond in new ways to that changing environment. So I think of culture as an instinct to mix innovation and imitation, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. This theorization of culture is actually quite different from the theorization that I heard when I was working in the development sector. And in the development sector, I was working in Central Asia and then doing field work on the development sector in Central Asia. I heard culture described more as a collection of practices or a collection of beliefs, a religious practice, a superstition, a way that you show hospitality. I also heard it as, within that collection of beliefs and practices, I heard a lot of tendencies. So tendencies to passivity, to individualism or collectivism, to trust or fatalism. All these kinds of cultural traits became part of collections that in aggregate were what culture was taken to be. And so that's the theorization of culture that I was trying to understand that my informants were working with. But I also found that that theorization of culture was quite limited in what it allowed them to do. So what is at stake here? I believe that how we conceptualize culture can shape how powerful people think about human diversity. And it shapes, therefore, the way that international interventions are designed and funded, so it can have real impacts on real people's lives. So that's the end of my theoretical introduction. So I'd like to move into my fieldwork experience. So I'm going to take you now to Central Asia. Maybe some of you have been there. And my first exposure to this whole world, not only to Central Asia, but to this whole world of development work, came in 1997. Seems like a generation ago, when I arrived in Central Asia. This was 6 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, so things were really in flux. A lot of people were really struggling to figure out how to navigate new economies, new expectations, a new government. It was also a time of great optimism. So I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Kyrgyzstan, and Kyrgyzstan was seen as this great land of hope. It was called the Switzerland of Central Asia. This was the Akayev era, the first part of the Akayev era. Tourism could happen here. It seemed receptive to ideas about democratization in the free market. So really optimistic time, and floods of money, of funding going into that region. Part of it, some of it, of course, going to the Peace Corps. But ultimately trying to take advantage of the end of the Soviet era to bring freedom to the former Soviet regions. And there's my picture of Akayev. That's from Jalalabad, where I was stationed, celebrating the future with our great president. His picture was everywhere. So this was a particular moment in development work worldwide. There was a shift going on, a slow shift away from modernization approaches to development. Modernization theory had really dominated development work since the 1950s. Modernization theory is based on evolutionary ideas about human progress. If you change technology, if you get a society industrialized, if you can kickstart innovation, then you're going to start to get production of wealth and all the other things that follow it, urbanization, additional technological change, and that's going to solve all the problems. I like to call this, here's a picture of kind of the shift into an urban society, factories, manufacturing. I came to think about this, my shorthand way of thinking about this was the wealth first approach. You create wealth, everything else is going to solve itself. Democracy will emerge, wealth will trickle down to everyone, and happiness will be the ultimate result. And of course, in Asia, the Soviet regime was a modernization regime par excellence. So it had invested a lot of funding, a lot of money into building factories, building infrastructure, creating energy infrastructure, trying to develop urban areas, shifting populations from agricultural lifestyles into urban lifestyles, building schools, universities, educating people, increasing literacy. And I'm not going to argue to you that there wasn't something good about that. There were a lot of great things that happened from that. A lot of people's living standards rose, people got education, women's lives were changed, absolutely. So there were a lot of really interesting, positive things that came out of that. But a little bit of medical development. But beginning in the 1970s and 80s, from the left, you started to have some criticisms of modernization. Not all of its promises were actually coming to be. So even though there were promises of growing wealth, inequality continued. Even though there were great promises of urbanization, urbanization brought new ills, slums all over the world, and the devastation that can cause, the illness. Modernization also brought more wealth, but it also created corruption, opportunities for corruption and wealth hoarding. I believe this is one of Saddam Hussein's palaces. Finally, it led to pollution and environmental degradation. So from the left, you started to have a lot of criticisms and other kinds of developmental rubrics that pushed back, tried to find other ways. Dependency theory emerged. Women in development became another one. There were a whole host of critiques that turned into new development projects in their own right. By the 1990s, though, by the end of the Cold War, the end of the Soviet Union, there was I think of it more as kind of a rediscovery of the modernization promise, but reformulated. So in this new understanding of how to create modernization, how can we modernize in a way that will build wealth, build democracy, build capitalism and innovation, a lot of this was informed by what was going on in Eastern Europe. We had the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then there was also the Solidarity movement in Poland and other Eastern European countries that were starting to reform. And these became very interesting to the development sector in general, worldwide. This called attention to a new approach to modernization. Rather than funneling money into government ministries and officials and letting them kind of figure out how to build wealth, let's see, and then instead creating corrupt ministries and corrupt officials, can we reform those institutions? So there was a shift to trying to modernize societies by first reforming the institutions that would ultimately make them more modern. So, for example, trying to find a way to build democracy. How can we create democracy? How can we encourage people to be more innovative? How can we encourage people to behave in ways that will build a capitalist market system, will build freedom in the political sphere? So, of course, taking a cue from those movements in Eastern Europe, Václav Havel, sorry if I can't say his name perfectly, has written about an important concept called civil society. Civil society became a key rallying cry for the development sector at this time. What is civil society? Well, it builds on the idea that people can build power, especially in the face of an authoritarian state. People build power insofar as they can unify, insofar as they can build networks together. Civil society is that sector of human activity that is not the state, it is not the market. It is a sector where we freely associate to learn about our desires, define our desires, and articulate our desires in the face of our government, to express our desires towards our government. And what I hear there, and maybe some of you will also hear this too, is the goal to reform institutions was understood to be removing the excesses of power, the accretions of power, to free people to live their natural lives, to live as free citizens, which is our natural birthright, to live as free economic actors, which would be our natural birthright. And if we could only do this, if we could only get power out of the way, corruption out of the way, then we'll get back to that great evolutionary modernist trajectory. So I like to think of this as the freedom first perspective as opposed to the wealth first perspective. You build wealth, you solve all the problems. We saw that didn't work. And now the new discourse is we open the space for freedom. We clear away all the obstacles to human freedom, and therefore you're going to have development is going to happen. So this shift, and ultimately you're going to open the way for a wonderful, wonderful human thriving, because humans' natural state is to be free. You probably can't see that to the back of the room, but there was a lot of funding going into this civil society activism. The Freedom Support Act from the United States poured a lot of money in. And this activism was focused on grassroots organizations. We can't give money to the state anymore, right? Because we don't trust the state. We don't want to create more corruption. We have to find people who are more free. We want to find those parts of society that connect us to civil society so we can build citizens' power. So a lot of this funding was going to grassroots organizations called non-governmental organizations. I refer to them as NGOs. People of that time, this was the late 90s, early 2000s, called this a period of grant rain. Money was falling from the sky. You had to just sign a form, create an NGO, and then start writing projects that would help build some of these new tendencies towards freedom. So the kinds of things that you would see, NGOs would be working on human rights defenses, Small business development, NGOs on women's rights appeared, educating people about voting, educating people about journalistic freedom, defending journalists' freedoms, activism for religious freedom. All of these kinds of organizations emerged, and they started being active in the society and being very well funded as well. So the Peace Corps was one of these organizations, and I'll explain why I consider it such. I mean, I think many of us think of the Peace Corps as cheap diplomats, right? Peace Corps volunteers go out, and they're this easy way for the United States to show a friendly, happy face in the world, and it doesn't cost a lot of money. But Peace Corps was also a key development agency in that model of building civil society and democratization. This is my Peace Corps group that I traveled with in 1997, and I worked there for 2 years. This is the office in Bishkek. It's beautiful gardens with flowers. The Peace Corps was engaged in 2 key projects. The first was English teaching, and the second was small enterprise development. So the small enterprise development volunteers were working with those NGOs. They were helping them set themselves up. They were making sure money was being used transparently. They were helping people think about innovative ways to engage with the market. And the English teaching volunteers, that was my program, were learning how to change the pedagogy in Central Asia. So we were learning how to, this was a time when a lot of the teachers who had been trained in the Soviet Union used very teacher-centered methods, where the teacher stood up, gave a lecture, the students memorized it back to the teacher, recited it back to the teacher, and there wasn't a lot of discussion. So that isn't very good for language fluency. So for the English teachers, we were, in our training that first summer before we went into the classroom, we were taught how to get students talking, get students thinking creatively, get students debating, have students explore their opinions, have them engage in creative problem solving, get them to question what they learn, help them see that a different relationship between a student and the authority figure in the room, help them explore that. What new possibilities for relationships of power can emerge from that kind of pedagogy? So I spent 2 years dutifully developing my students in that way, all kinds of communicative activities, trying to emphasize creativity, emphasizing debate and discussion and consensus building in my classroom. These are some of my students. It was in the winter time, so we all had our coats. There was no heat in the classroom. And of course, I taught them American values. I was the face of democracy, freedom, human rights, women's rights, and I tried to bring those into my lessons. So both the content of lessons as well as the style of pedagogy was trying to help contribute to bringing a better understanding of freedom, political freedom, and ultimately, hopefully, something that would impact the market, making people freer in the market as well. I came back a couple of years later to study the development sector because I remained really really interested in it and puzzled by it and wanting to understand it better. I felt like even as a development worker, I really hadn't understood what I was doing, and I wanted to understand it better. So I came back and I actually started to do fieldwork among the NGO sector. So these were the people, this was the side of development that I had less contact with. And I discovered something really interesting, and that was the exercises, the pedagogy, the approach to learning and presenting content that I had been taught, that I had been using as a Peace Corps volunteer, was now being used by all the NGOs in their trainings, in their workshops, in their roundtables. So for example, this picture comes from a workshop on lobbying. So rather than getting up and explaining the legal regime of lobbying and how you lobby, et cetera, the NGO leader got up and immediately put people into small groups, gave people these big, huge pieces of paper, and said, okay, I want you to think about something in your community that is wrong. Tell me about something in your community that you want to change. Okay, so everybody scribbled dutifully again, talking with each other, debating and talking and then scribbling. Okay, now, next step. Now I would like you to come up with a possible solution. Everybody went back to their small groups and they started writing out, what could we do? What kind of a solution could we give? And the third step was, who can you go to get these kinds of solutions to be put in place? So there was this kind of active pedagogy that was being used to train Soviet citizens, formerly Soviet citizens, those passive citizens who had allowed the government to take care of them from cradle to grave, to kind of shift their subjectivity, to shift the way that they thought about their own power and the power of the state, to help them see how they could make a change. So here's another picture. This is the picture of one of the presenters, one of the participants, now telling the rest of the group what he had discovered or what he had found, what his group had discussed. So, and one other really interesting project that I observed, I actually spent a lot more time with this project, was a very widespread project to develop civics education. So this was actually in a school system, and mixing the development focus on democratization with, again, this more pedagogical in the school approach, trying to help young people, it was 10th and 11th formers, trying to help these young people actually learn about democracy, learn about civic participation, getting them into their community, talking with their village councils, talking to their parents, questioning traditions that they practiced. A lot of, again, interactive activity, activities that were designed very much outside of the realm of their experience of, read a textbook, memorize it, repeat it back. Outside of that realm of experience, and instead to explore ways of questioning authority and working together and finding consensus. And together with, and so ultimately what emerged from these lessons and from these workshops was this lesson of be free. We want you to be free. We want you to experience democracy and all of the benefits of that. So also at the same time, of course, the critique of the Soviet citizen and the Soviet regime continued in the development sector. So there was a lot of concern about the continuing influence of other types of cultural traits, the passivity that the Soviet Union had created, the traditionalism that was an obstacle to this work, the lack of critical thinking about in problem solving, the willingness, as one development director, one development activist said to me, the willingness to walk by a burned out light bulb in your hallway for a year and not do anything. We're here to teach people to actually change that light bulb. We want to show people that they have power, that they can make a change to their environment. So ultimately, of course, the goal is by creating citizens that could effectively bring about democracy, to kind of change this map here so that it would be more free. Of course, Kyrgyzstan has been, every time I pull this map, I'm interested to see if Kyrgyzstan has flipped back. It flips back and forth quite a bit, and I actually will say a little bit more about that interesting pattern in a second. So reflecting then on the theories of social change that the development sector was using at that time, and how that connects to a certain understanding of culture that I've already said I think was an understanding of culture that sees it as a collection of traits and a collection of habits and traits. There were a lot of parallels with some problematic scholarship among actually quite reputable political scientists and other social scientists. Some of you might be familiar with the collection Culture Matters, and if some of you younger people aren't familiar with that, then yay, I would really be glad to hear about that. But so there, for a while, this came out in 2000, for a while in the late 1990s and 2000s, there was this really vocal group of social scientists who were giving a scholarly veneer to some of these ideas that I was hearing in the development sector. So to explain more concisely what the problem is, I'm going to kind of break it down for you the way that I like to think about it. So I call this perspective culture matters thinking. And culture matters thinking, or CMT. And to me, wherever culture matters thinking is informing development work, we have a problem, which I'll go into in a second. So there are three parts of culture matters thinking. The first part is bounded. Culture is is defined by boundaries. So oftentimes in this scholarship you see that cultures follow nation-state boundaries. Sometimes they get agglomerated into larger cultural regions. So for example, Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations his model created something looking about like that. The second part of this is that those bounded cultures, once we've drawn the lines around this reified, bounded kind of notion of culture, within the boundaries there's a homogeneity that exists, kind of a predictable homogeneity that we can expose through empirical research. So you have a lot of people who've gone out and actually done survey work who come up with conclusions that seem quite rigorous about patterns of, for example, collectivism and individualism that follow some of these patterns. More recently, the World Values Survey, this is the most sophisticated example of this, and it's absolutely the examples that are much more recent that I'm familiar with come out of this way of thinking. So thinking about different parts of the world and the values that shape them as these homogeneous entities. The third part of this tripartite understanding of culture, called culture matters thinking, is that you've got these bounded, homogeneous cultural entities, and culture within them is a force. It has an impact. So if you've got trust and optimism and individualism, it leads to certain types of outcomes. If you have passivity and fatalism, it leads to other types of outcomes. And so all of this is done with very sophisticated mathematics, quantitative research. So one example that might be familiar to some people is Robert Putnam's work. You probably know of him as the bowling alone scholar, sociologist. Before he did that, there was some really interesting work that he did on democratization in Italy, where he and his colleagues measured the types of social bonds that people had, the social connections people had, and then were able to correlate that with levels of democracy in different parts of Italy. So this was, of course, embraced by the development sector and held up as the model, like, okay, we just have to get people to be more trusting, and then we're going to have better democratization. Of course, later critics found a lot of problems with that research. But the key point here is that this approach to development sees a predictability about these outcomes. Okay, so, but how can I connect this then to the Kyrgyz material? Well, remember that this was a moment where all of the activism was trying to encourage Kyrgyz people to be, Kyrgyzstanis, to be more active, to challenge their corrupt government officials. At the end of this period of my field work, what happened? This was 2005. There was actually a revolution called the Tulip Revolution. The Tulip Revolution, it was a massive mobilization against that early president, Oscar Akayev. People were frustrated at this time, right? There was a lot of economic problems. There was a lot of corruption on display. There were some election irregularities that were making people really angry. There was some problems, people's standards of living and energy costs and all these kinds of problems had led people to be really dissatisfied. And then add to that, certain networks of elites who seemed to be able to mobilize people's grievances. It started in regional capitals. This is the governor building where I was living in Jalalabad, which is an oblast or state or province capital. It started with people amassing at these government buildings, and then they would occupy the government building. It happened in Jalalabad, it happened in Osh, the other big state next door. And then ultimately, this is again the Jalalabad state. So the citizens have occupied the government building, but the army has been brought in, or the police have been brought in to keep the peace. And then ultimately, huge crowds amassed in Bishkek, which is the capital of the city. They marched on the White House, which is the seat of government. And Akayev, according to some accounts, fled in a helicopter, basically for his safety. And so you can imagine how the development sector, what the discourse was in the development sector at that moment. I mean, it was just jubilation. Here we've been working so hard, and here they got rid of this terrible, corrupt dictator. This shows the power of the people. People are getting that message. So what happened next? Kurmanbek Bakiev succeeded Akayev. He's a former Akayev ally, now opposition leader for a while. He was the next president, and unfortunately, things became corrupt and authoritarian almost immediately. There really wasn't that much change in the nature of the regime. And in fact, by the end of Bakiyev's time, a lot of people were saying Bakiyev was actually much worse. So the pattern actually that is emerging here is not necessarily one of democratization. It's not necessarily one of people becoming freer citizens. But it's also not one that matches the development discourse. Oh, people in former Soviet regions are so passive, they don't challenge the authority, they don't innovate. So something about their understanding of what was going on, I believe, is not quite accurate. One way I think about it is just to reflect on what was going on since the fall of the Soviet Union. So since 1991, people have been faced with incredible dislocation and change. A changing environment that they had to respond to in ways that they had no model to use as they responded to it. There's another word for that, innovation. So on full display, anytime you walk into a bazaar, people were using innovation to respond to an economic situation that was unprecedented and certainly unfamiliar to them in their own lives. It was on full display, and yet one didn't hear in the development sector recognition of that creativity. Even people, as they dealt with the corrupt bureaucratic officials, there was a lot of creativity. If you listen to people's stories about how they paid bribes and how they managed to work behind the scenes to get what they needed, there was a lot of creativity, a lot of critical thinking, a lot of action going on. Not the story that I was hearing in the development sector. So in other words, these are just some more pictures of bazaars. I love the chaos of the bazaar, and it's not chaotic. It's very organized. They feel chaotic when you walk in, and then as you get to see them better, you see not only the creativity on display, but also the organization and the way people are making their lives through this wonderful institution that is the bazaar. So what I started to think about, and I hope what I can convince you of today, is that the same criticism that we applied to modernization theory can be applied to some of this freedom first and civil society approach to development. So let me go back through what that critique is and also add a little bit more to it. So the criticism of modernization theory that is probably most familiar is that you can't predict an economy. Human society, human economies, human political situations are too complex. I can't, as an expert sitting in an office in the World Bank, I can't know what these people on the ground need. And that's a simple idea, that's a familiar idea, that's just, the Adam Smith free market idea. But I'm going to use the vocabulary of complexity theory here in order to also apply it to the freedom first approach. So when I say that a human market is complex, I'm meaning it in a technical sense. Human institutions are actually complex open systems. What is a complex open system? It is a collection of numerous agents that are interacting constantly. A complex open system receives energy from outside it, and that energy fuels that interaction, and that interaction creates effects, outputs. It also creates forms of organization. So the other important thing that we learn from complexity, from systems theory, but also from the systems theory that focuses on complex systems, is that these systems are not predictable. You can, whether it's a weather pattern or a pattern of earthquakes over history, there are so many places where we see complex systems and we can see that they are not predictable. That has been demonstrated mathematically. So the same thing is going on here in the development sector. So we have people saying, we know how we're going to change their institutions and what that output is, what the effect is going to be. But actually, they're underestimating how complex the human society is. it isn't about building trust and, like the Italy example, you just automatically get democratization. Human society is not that simple. It's actually very complex. Those kinds of outcomes are not predictable. So I think the reason people were making that mistake and underestimating the predictability of these interventions is because they were seeing freedom as some kind of natural state of human existence. They were kind of building on a liberal notion, classically liberal notion of freedom, where freedom is a natural state of human existence, and we need to somehow bring all these citizens and all these market agents into a more natural state of freedom. When, of course, anthropologists in the room know that culture is underneath all of that. There is no free human being beyond culture. There is no free human being beyond power. So how can we understand culture then? If we're going to say culture doesn't include things like traits like how free we are, how active or how passive we are. That's why I want to go back to an understanding of culture that doesn't see culture as a collection of traits, how free we are, how innovative we are, but that sees culture as an instinct to mix innovation. I'm not using the word freedom, I'm using the word innovation, to mix innovation and learning and imitation. So anthropologists have been developing this idea for a long time. I mean, we got rid of the culture as a collection of beliefs and practices by the 1960s, I would say. I mean, it's hard to get rid of it completely. You still hear people say, oh, well, my culture is like this and your culture is like that, which I try to get away from completely because I think of culture as more of a mechanism or an instinct. In recent decades, there has been really this development of an understanding of culture as a way of mixing freedom and conventionality. I would argue that that's basically Bourdieu's idea of habitus. Lévi-Strauss has the idea of bricolage, which brings that idea out. Solon's idea of the structure of the conjuncture. I mean, there's many, many examples of culture being described as, to use Rosaldo Levi and Narayan's words, a dialectic of innovation and tradition. And so that really helps us get out of this notion of culture as a bounded entity that's a collection of things that have a force. But I think that we can go further than what the anthropologists have done. And we have to go further because we have to be a louder voice in working against these discourses from the development sector that continue to use CMT. So I found that the most interesting and helpful place to go, kind of unexpectedly, for me as a cultural anthropologist, is to look at some of the biological research, to look at psychological research. A really interesting place to start here is ecological psychology. Tim Ingold is an anthropologist who has drawn on this work in a really interesting way. And he talks about culture, he describes culture as a process of learning. So again, a wonderful and very clear departure from the bounded entity with a force type of learning. He talks about culture as an attunement, a way that we attune to the environment. It's a way of educating attention. Anthropologists have been talking about culture as a process, not a thing, for decades. But he, I think, does a much better job of explaining what that process is. It's how we learn. Then when we look at some of the biological anthropologists and the ways that they've studied evolution and how human beings, and there's also some neuropsychology that I found that's really interesting, they have brought some evolutionary insights to bear on those insights about human learning. We've learned that human beings have evolved in certain ways over millions of years, but also within the scope of the development of a human organism. Merlin Donald is a neuropsychologist who writes about the human capacity for mimesis. We have an unparalleled ability to self-consciously mimic other people. We recognize that they are other, we recognize that we are ourselves, and we try to do what they are doing. That's the kind of unparalleled, unusual thing that human beings have learned to do. There are some other theorists who talk about the emergence of that type of activity in evolution. So one of my one of the more interesting things that I've read was Richardson and Boyd are some evolutionary anthropologists who've connected this style of learning to the Pleistocene epoch about 2.6 million years ago. And they've argued that actually because for the last several million years, the climate was more, there was a lot more change going on, and it created evolutionary pressure for the human being to mix this imitation and innovation in a very particular amount. So, and it's one of the more interesting ironies here, of course, is when you look at the animal kingdom, you find that actually it's the imitation part of our heritage that is more unusual. Animals all across the animal world innovate. They have to do new things. Merlin Donald writes, speaking about how apes can't learn from each other, every generation starts afresh because the old die with their wisdom sealed forever in their brains. But human beings have this amazing ability to do both, to imitate other people and then to apply that to an environment that is incredibly dynamic in new ways, or else we wouldn't survive. So if we accept this, if we accept that all human beings are both innovators and imitators, that means that if we accept the idea that culture is an instinct, then we have to accept that it doesn't matter whether you live in a command economy or a Soviet regime or a so-called democracy like ours. We are all beings who have access to some type of activity that is free. I prefer to call it innovative. And we're all at the heart able to mimic those around us and combine that with innovation in a way that keeps our human society a complex society on the edge of chaos. So that's the other really interesting part of this systems research that shows complex systems never devolve into chaos and they never devolve into equilibrium. They are this incredibly dynamic systems that stay active but are always changing. So if we think about culture as this balance between imitation and innovation, what are the implications for development? First of all, it situates human diversity at a much deeper level of our experience. It both unifies the human family as well as explains why we are both unified and so profoundly diverse. It tells the lie to attempts to make predictions about how certain traits will play out or certain changes or certain values can impact our societies. It tells the lie to the attempt to identify cultures as these bounded entities and to identify certain cultures and certain cultural traits as more conducive to human striving, because it understands that this idea of culture itself is imaginary. There are no traits and values that align better with some ideal sense of human nature. There is no human nature. Which is also to say that there is no one person or one group that has a better understanding of freedom that can go out into the world and teach other people. So for me, the important thing is that for the development sector is not only does it remind us that we can't necessarily predict how our development interventions will have an impact. I'm not saying that they won't have an impact. They could very well have a positive impact. We just don't know. We can't predict it. And we can't say that societies won't change. Societies will change. We just don't know if they're going to change because of us, and because of us, how. But more importantly, we don't know what well-being we want to create. Because human beings are so diverse, and they have such different desires and ways of thinking about their own lives, we can't necessarily prescribe this way of being, our vision of democracy, our vision of innovation and free market activity as being the one that will help you. And so for me, the goal is to try to make that message heard. I think this is a message that anthropologists have been saying for many generations. But for whatever reason, it continues to be one that hasn't found yet an audience in the wider sphere. That is some of the these are some of the sources that I've relied on a lot that I find really helpful. And I will stop there. Thank you. Questions from the floor?
so much for
Sure.
a wonderful lecture. Was incredible to trace the development of your argument. And I was wondering if you have any opinion on the current situation in Afghanistan and how it contributes to your argument. Just anything.
Interesting. By current situation, I think you mean the American has pulled
Yes.
out, and we now have a new government that is trying to do its work. So actually the first place that my mind goes to is chaos. What I've learned, though, is that most human society across history, the argument that I'm making is that we can link it back to this evolved capacity we have to mix innovation and imitation. I'm arguing, and I will stand by that because we have that instinct, human societies historically do not fall off the precipice. We stay on that wonderful, productive, interesting edge, sometimes horrific edge of chaos. There was one of the scholars that I don't know if it's on that list, there was a scholar in a collection on chaos and anthropology that looked at the situation in Rwanda, where it looked like chaos to a lot of people. What you had is increasing returns. That's a complexity theory word for small things can lead to big effects that you don't expect. That's why it's unpredictable. But what you also have is after those kinds of increasing returns, you have a return to the mean. And that's what distinguishes a complex system from chaos, is you always have this kind of attractor point and you have this return to the mean happening. So that's why you don't actually spiral off into chaos. People are still responding using cultural texts. Some of them are bad. Murder your neighbor is a bad way to live your life, right? But there's something that pulls them back from that chaos. So, I would be much more concerned about something like global warming as something that could push us off, maybe. But in terms of Afghanistan, I am a glass half full person, and I think it's going to be a really horrific situation for a while. But I do think that it's not going to go off the rails in terms of into some kind of chaos. One thing that is really interesting about the Afghanistan situation is how big an impact a lot of the democratization work did have. You really saw that people were educated now, especially urban areas, not outside, but you really see that there was a lot of positive impact helping women. So, some of the arguments that I make about you can't predict outcomes, I do think that one has to be a little bit careful, but all I can say is that what I've done, the research that I was doing for this work kind of makes me more of an optimist. Things aren't going to get too bad. They're not going to necessarily get really good, and for a lot of people they will be very bad, but if you look, one of the things I also learned from this research is to look at things at a longer scale, which is kind of dehumanizing, because you step away from the individual person's experience, which can be very horrific and traumatizing. But from the longer scale, you do see societies shifting. Authoritarian societies do shift to become more democratic. Of course, you do see more wealth in the world. We do see that poverty has been reduced over the very, very, very long term. Of course, you also see some backsliding, and global warming is going to make that a lot worse. Very hard question, but thank you.
I am going to share a question that came over online.
Sure.
From Arthur Mangozi, who's a second-year master's student here at Kyrgyz. I'm just going to read what he says. Arthur is always very articulate. Thank you so much, Dr. Borbieva, for this intriguing presentation. I'm curious about whether this recent yearning for a return to Soviet society in some segments of the Russian population is present in Kyrgyzstan as well. Taking your thesis that culture is an instinct, could one say that some members of post-Soviet society simply have an instinct for comparatively less democratized or free market economic models as guarantors of social stability?
So the instinct that I'm talking about is much, I mean, I don't want to, the metaphor, this is not the best metaphor, but this is the best one I can come to right now. It's deeper than that, right? I'm not saying that people in different cultures can have different instincts about things. I'm saying that all human beings have evolved. We all have that instinct. So whether or not people in the Soviet, who've grown up in the Soviet times, now feel nostalgia for the lost ideals that they remember, it makes a lot of sense because those were maybe for many of them formative years, and it was a time when they learned how to interact in the world and they felt supported by their community. I think there's a certain amount of idealization that can go on, but I also know from living in that region that, especially in the 1990s, things were better in some before the Soviet Union collapsed. So I just want to make sure to clarify that I am not separating people. I'm saying that this is something that unifies us in a very, very profound way. I hope I understood the question correctly, but I think I'll leave it like that. Yes?
Thank you. Wow, that's loud. Thank you so much for your talk.
Sure,
I really enjoyed it. I thought it was very thought-provoking and extremely articulate, and I love seeing the pictures from Kyrgyzstan because I haven't been able to go for so long, so thank you.
Sure.
I have several questions, but I'm going to stick to one that builds on what the question from the MA student. I love the idea of approaching culture as an instinct to mix innovation and imitation, and thinking about how that's something that is it's common to all of us, right? So it's almost like you're saying there's one big culture, but there are still little cultures, right? So I'm wondering, what's the relationship? If you can say something between the relationship between our human ability to mix, or to have this instinct to mix innovation and imitation, and then how the collection of beliefs and practices that surrounds us, what you were talking about sort of as, I guess as power, the power structures that surround us, which include these collections of beliefs and practices that sometimes are imposed on us, how that affects our ability to innovate and imitate.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I spend more time, so this talk focused like maybe on 2 or 3 of the chapters in my book, but I do spend some time talking about learning and embodied learning. So I talk a little bit about cross-cultural adaptation and exploring how, so in cross-cultural adaptation, this is a field of research, I think a lot of psychologists and sociologists maybe, and it also takes culture as these bounded entities, and there's kind of this teleological process where you cross the boundary into the other culture and you learn the culture, and you're good at that culture. And then also you develop an intercultural consciousness, etc. I find a lot about that perspective very interesting. I find interesting the idea that we learn from those around us in order to achieve homeostasis. So our instinctual need is to learn from people around us in a way that allows us to feel a sense of well-being or contentment, to maximize our well-being or our contentment. And so when you're interacting with the same people and learning the same things from the same people, you are going to start to learn a repertoire, I'm not going to say collection, a repertoire of some of the same practices. But the minute you go to the next village or the next country or get on an airplane, you are going to bring your learning. A lot of that learning is embodied. So this is something that anthropology has to offer that's really great. How much of culture is embodied? It's not just these language scripts in our brain. It's not just linguistic. It's embodied learning. And so it's very deeply rooted. It's not easy to get rid of it or change it. But when you move to that next environment and you're at a step with it, people have a different dialect, or the example I use in my book is people take their shoes off at the door, right? So then you have to learn those things. And so you're going to learn what you need to be able to, again, achieve that kind of homeostasis. What I'm not saying that people don't have similarities. People do, and it's through that, but I think it's useful to think about it with attention to that complexity model is you have these agents you have people who are interacting with each other, and there's this kind of emergent property of similarity, but let's not bound it. And so that it becomes more of a probability, because we all know that we're individuals too. I don't do everything that other people do who are members of my same culture. A lot of it I've learned from them. I also have, my own idiosyncrasies. And when I go to Central Asia, I adopt some of the things that people do there. I don't even think about it. So I think that it's possible to, or I argue, I will stand by that argument, and other people may disagree, but I think it's absolutely possible to say people who live near each other and interact with each other are going to develop the same traits because they're interacting for that exact reason. They're interacting with each other, and they're learning from each other. But we don't need to also bound that. It's more difficult to talk that way. It takes a little bit more attention to metaphor, but yeah. But thank you.
Thank you so much for your lecture this morning.
Sure.
Sorry to shift gears here a
Sure.
little bit, but I was wondering if, in speaking to your experience with the Peace Corps and your democratization efforts at that time, what would be your evaluation of current American democratization efforts abroad in the face of what many consider a degradation of democracy domestically?
I certainly don't claim to be an expert on what is going on now. I've kind of shifted my focus to more of the systems research and institutional change. But are there any specific places? Are you thinking more about Central Asia or other particular projects?
I'm not speaking mostly towards specific examples, but more so, do you feel that, the U.S. should be sponsoring and pushing these democratization efforts when many think that there isn't a good foundation domestically from which to?
I guess I've tended to try to plot a agnostic position on some of those things, because I'm trying to see it from the bigger picture. Like, human beings are going to interact with each other, right? If these people have power and they want something over there, they are going to send money that way. When you look more, of course, we're going to have a political debate, and maybe after this lecture, you and I can talk about our political positions vis-a-vis humanitarian aid, and that's, I think, a very different conversation. But within the anthropological position that I'm trying to stake here, I'm trying to see it from the larger point of view, and I'm understanding the larger system of experimentation. So one of the funny ironies that I found among some of these critics of modernization was they would say, oh, the market needs to be free. You have to, because it's a complex system, and so therefore don't put a regulation on it because of complexity, theory, and all the things that I was just saying. But wait, why are we only looking at the market? The entire human society is a complex system. And so that regulation that you put on the market is part of that experimentation that the whole universe is unfolding because of. So I think that it's going to happen, and I don't know if I want to say it's good or bad. It's interesting. I want to watch it and see what happens. I don't think you can predict what will happen. But it is also, I think, some of us, it will provoke people who will say, interesting that this country that can't keep its own house clean and put together is out there. Of course, that's been true for a long time, but that we're out there lecturing the whole rest of the world. Anyone who spent time, I'm sure, in Central Asia can tell stories about that kind of wonderful dissonance.
Hi, thanks for such an interesting talk, and also such an interesting window onto the development world and what was going on there. I have sort of two related questions about your overall thesis and the strategy. I'm an anthropologist, a sociocultural anthropologist, and so when you use the word instinct, I take that as a provocation of sorts. but at the same time understand that this is an old tradition in anthropology to think about the fact that on the one hand, there is no nature, there's no human nature, there's no natural body, it's always socially inflected.
Yeah.
We get that from most, but then anthropologists have also come up with lots of other things that are also something all humans do everywhere, which, as you know, things like Mary Douglas's argument about coherence, Levi-Strauss about binary thinking and sort of the tendency, Barth's on how boundaries create difference.
Barth, I didn't hear the name.
Barth, so thinking about all of these other ways that you could also talk about are instinctive, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
So things that are universal, but at the same time they create difference. Obviously, people are socialized, they imitate differently. Like the people in one household don't imitate the same.
Right.
They all are socialized into imitating certain kinds of behaviors and not others. So we have lots of examples from anthropology about how this works and how it creates diversity and complexity and lack of ability. So I'm curious why you then are, I guess what's startling to me is that you're first of all focusing on imitation and innovation. And maybe it's just because of you're trying to disrupt this development discourse. But why you're going back to biological, like the difference between humans and apes to make this argument. Because that seems to sort of actually, in many cases, lead right into some of these really crazy evolutionary biology arguments where you have like office politics explained by testosterone levels of chimpanzees. I mean, right?
Yeah.
So it's so it seems like a strategic move on your part to tie into these other disciplines that don't necessarily come into the kinds of outcomes that you're talking about. So I just wanted you to say something more about that.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much for that critique. That's the kind of thing I've really been interested to hear. And I do want to think about those kinds of implications. This project wasn't, I should just say that this project wasn't strategic. It was kind of like, I was just trying to answer a question for myself. I was trying to understand the cross-cultural adaptation process, and then connecting it to things that I was reading in these areas that I mentioned. And so the reason that I want to go back to the instinct word, and I admit I'm not a biologist, so I don't know exactly how instincts work. I guess they're somehow programmed in the genes and selected for over time. But I think it's possible to say that is something that all human beings have in common, but I don't think that necessarily leads to all women are nurturing and all men are hunters. This kind of biological, this evolutionary psychology that you mentioned that is very troubling. My sole goal here is to move in the absolute opposite direction, to explore how to define human diversity or how to define human unity that allows for, as diverse as anthropologists have been screaming for years about how to do that, anthropologists have been screaming for years about how diverse we are, and then just trying to offer another way to think about it, and maybe it's a metaphor, maybe it's not actually real, I don't know, a way to think about how profoundly diverse we are, but also unified. And you mentioned the whole split between nature and culture. So, again, like that is what I'm trying to reject here. Because we are natural. Culture is part of nature. That's, I guess, one of the things I was trying to say, is that binary is, we construct it, sure, it exists in some kind of social sense, but it's not necessarily out in the universe, because culture is this outgrowth, what we're calling culture is this outgrowth of, or what I'm calling culture is this outgrowth of us as biological organisms. I just don't want to let that go. And I find that the embodiment research, the focus on embodiment, like in the tradition of Bourdieu and going back to some of the earlier theories, like that's what really took me there, because I started to really think about how profoundly physical we are. And then if we are physical, then I think we do have to connect. You know, Gertz always said we're not these layers, right? We're not like the psychology layer, the culture layer, the this and the that. Like, so trying to understand more from a holistic point of view, it's very possible that I haven't got the edge of your question, the criticism, but I hope that we can talk afterwards, and you can help me see that, because that's, for me, is the really interesting place, is where's the problem here? The weak link is what I'm getting at. I don't know if we have any more time. So.
We have time for, I think, maybe one more question.
Okay.
And there's one that came in online. We might have time for two, we'll see. For those who are online, those of us who are here in person, we have lots of questions. But one question that came in online has to do with the issue of, if you're defining culture as really a biological imperative, you know, a kind of the instinct toward needing a script, you know, as it were, like the instinct that has us reaching for either a received procedure or an innovation,
right.
As opposed to just acting randomly or chaotically, which we, in fact, I thought the Afghanistan question actually was excellent, because the most recent reporting this week is really focused on how calm everything is, which is quite interesting given the circumstances. But the one of our attendees has asked, asked specifically about the Hofstede model of cultural dimensions, which you might have to gloss for some members of the audience, but is asking about the role of models like that, and whether they can give us any sense of the differences across cultures, or are they just typically, once again, misapplying and reinforcing cultural stereotypes? In other words, if we're looking at culture as this sort of, as we said, of a kind of biological imperative that's universal, is there any way productively to describe cultural difference?
Right. Yeah, I think, so the Hofstede dimensions, right? And I can't remember, I think there's a couple of them, like collectivism, individualism is one. I can't remember what some of the other ones are. I think that's the one that's most common. It's clear that it's measuring something, because you have all of these people out there doing this kind of work, what I call culture matters thinking, measuring people's traits and then finding these patterns. I mean, the World Values Survey is just amazing. Like, you can go on there and just go down these rabbit holes of how these different traits interact with each other, and oh my goodness. And it really gives you an interesting perspective on the world, and some theories about social change. So they're certainly measuring something. I just don't know if they're measuring what they think they're measuring. So, like, for example, the World Values Theory survey, I sat down with the Kyrgyz and the English trying to make sense of it. So what you get is the theorist has decided what the traits are, right? And the theorist has decided what the questions to ask. So it becomes a really interesting instrument to understand the theorists, the survey takers who are doing it. I'm not saying we can't do it in a more sophisticated way, in which case, there's more cultural diversity in the way we ask the surveys, but I think, at some point there's kind of this point of diminishing returns where you try to make it more appropriate for a particular context, but then you run into some of the problems I've been talking about. Culture isn't a thing, it's not a bounded collection of objects, and then you also run into the problem that then it isn't scalable, it isn't generalizable. So I think that, again, I'm not saying that we can't talk about patterns. The phrase I use in my book is patterns of patterns. And probabilities. There are probabilities and patterns of probabilities. If you go to Central Asia, very, very likely that you're going to be told to take your shoes off before you go into somebody's house. Here, not so much. There are historical reasons for that. There are cultural reasons for that. I'm willing to use cultural as an adjective. But so I think that it's just don't put the boundary on it. As long as we don't put boundaries around it, I think we're okay, and we recognize it. It's fluid. I mean, we've been saying that right for a long time in anthropology. It's fluid. It's contextual. And then when the rubber hits the road, we go back to these bounded talking. It creeps up in these discourses. So, thank you.
I think that might be an excellent spot to stop. Not at a boundary, not
where
at a
the rubber
boundary
hits the
so
road.
much.
Okay.
But yeah, where the rubber hits the road. Thank you once again for joining us in Ann Arbor and giving this really wonderful, provocative talk, which will be archived on our YouTube channel. And there was a question also about, someone wanted to grab your list of suggested readings, which we will suggest people can easily do if they go to the YouTube recording and simply scrub to the end of the video, which will have the projection included. Thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for coming out.